Welcome to The Lens with me, Sarah Travers. The Lens is a business in the community podcast in partnership with One Young World. Well, our guests today are Sean Doyle, Chairman and Chief Executive of British Airways, a company that probably needs no introduction as one of the world's biggest airlines. And alongside Sean, we welcome Mirko Schedlbauer, founder and CEO of SHIPZERO, a Hamburg-based startup dedicated to decarbonising the logistics industry through innovative data solutions. Now, in this episode, we'll be discussing how can business create a better world. We'll be finding out what our guests are focusing on in their organisations to benefit their people, the planet, and communities. And of course, we'll be discovering a little more about who these gentlemen are beyond their job titles. To find out, let's get into the conversation. Sean, Mirko, welcome to The Lens. Sean, if you don't mind, I'd love to start with you. And if you could please tell our Lens listeners a little bit about yourself and how you've come to be in your role at British Airways.
Well, as you can probably gather from my accent, I don't come from the UK. I was born in Cork in a town called Youghal. I've been over working at British Airways since about 1998. I've had quite a kind of fascinating career in the airline and undertaken a lot of roles. But, I went to the local school, did a Bachelor of Commerce degree in UCC. I qualified as a management accountant. And British Airways was recruiting for finance analysts back in 1998. I said I'd come to the airline for a couple of years and see the world a bit and travel. And 26 years later, I'm still here. I undertook a number of finance roles. And then I moved across into a non-finance role by becoming head of strategy for the airline and looking after all of our business planning. I then headed up our commercial business in the Americas for a couple of years, which was fantastic, learning how to manage people at the coalface, so to speak, in terms of dealing with our customers and marketing and selling on behalf of the airline. And I was fortunate in 2016 to join the management committee as Director of Network and Strategy. And then I was asked to run Aer Lingus for a couple of years, which brought me back to Dublin in 2019. And then in October 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, I was asked to come back and take over the reins at British Airways. So, I'm very grateful. I think I've had a lot of opportunity, a little bit of luck along the way. But I find the airline industry absolutely fascinating, and I feel very honored to, lead an iconic airline like British Airways.
It is an absolutely iconic airline. But what do you do outside of work? Tell us about your home life.
Yeah, well, I've my wife Sophie and we live locally in Hammersmith, and I have a son Oliver who's getting into his teenage years. I like to play golf. I like to read. I like to get out and socialize with friends, and time permitting, I do a little bit of running as well. I love sport. I love reading about history as well. I like kind of staying current with the world around us.
Let's bring in Mirko now. Mirko's been listening, joining us from Hamburg today. I'd love to hear a little bit of journey to where you are and this incredible startup, SHIPZERO, which is doing so well.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes. And as you can probably also hear from my accent, I'm also not from the UK, but from Germany, born and raised here, just around Hamburg. Initially, I personally wanted to earn a living in sports. This didn't work out too well. I decided to study computer science and went into consulting afterwards, getting my hands dirty on a lot of financial data. Afterwards, I went to Switzerland to study innovation management and sustainability, and there noticed that there is quite a gap between those two professions, and this disconnect became even more apparent in the logistics industry because it's still growing and it's under digitized and super complex and will therefore have a quite hard time decarbonizing. And yeah, that was kind of the starting point for us to get going with SHIPZERO. What we've built is a very specialized platform for the end-to-end management of emissions in the logistics industry. So our customers are either logistics companies or also companies that buy logistics services. So can be manufacturers of any kind that manage a supply chain that is usually then global with all the challenges connected to it. We're around 60 people, all based here in Hamburg, and it's challenging, but also fun.
Isn't that so interesting? And there's a little bit of a synergy going on here already. We've got a bit of financial and number crunching going on here, which I'm sure Sean is very keen to know more about. But it is just that managing of huge beasts, isn't it? And all of the information that we absolutely need. I'd just love to know your thoughts on that importance of being data driven and crunching the numbers.
There is not this one silver bullet that you can use to decarbonize the industry, but you have to find the levers here and there based on the data and finding out where to invest and where to put your attention to. If you notice, oh, we want to decarbonize by 20%, then it's not enough to kind of go after those 0.01% levers that you might find as pure efficiency gains. But then you need to identify the bigger levers when it comes to, for example, other types of fuel or changing modes of transport. So those kind of things are not going to be done just based on intuition.
So Sean, what about you? Bring in your experience now at British Airways. Talk through the importance of being data driven.
Yeah, look, I think in our business, data is fundamental. But, we're lucky in that we have lots of data and lots of touch points. And I think what we're focusing on now is one, capturing it, two, structuring it, and three, using it in a way that is turned into very, very useful insights. If you look at sort of the evolution of aviation as a transport mode, it's been very much the first to use a lot of network distribution capability. We use data at every point in our operation. But it's getting quite exciting in terms of the ability to integrate all of your data sources and then to actually use it to optimize your business. And I feel that we now are in the middle of a big investment program. We're spending about 7 billion modernizing BA, but a massive chunk of that is going into our applications and also creating, I think, a data platform that we can use to become more efficient in the future. So everything from how we roster, how we run an operation, how we deal with disruption, how we deal with weather, how we optimize fuel, how we put in front of customers the kind of experience they want. It's all going to be driven increasingly by much better and more immediate data insights. It's quite a journey because I think, as Mirko said, you got to be very disciplined. You can get distracted by stuff which is on the periphery of things which are important, or you can be focused on the things that make a real difference. It's increasingly, I think, becoming quite exciting, the power of technology and the power of data and the way it can transform businesses.
So we're really talking today about how can business create a better world. So that brings us into the whole area of sustainability. And Sean, how do you balance the economic goals of an airline with its environmental responsibilities?
The reality, as Mirko said, is, there is no silver bullet because technologies which are an alternative to gas turbine propulsion are coming, but they may not be around for another 20 or 30 years. But you can't just sort of be apathetic about it. So the first thing is actually there is a big coincidence between sustainability goals and economic goals, because if I look at aviation over the last 30 years, we've always been trying to make and become more fuel efficient, whether it's our aircraft manufacturers or engine manufacturers. The average fuel consumed per kilometer traveled has been falling dramatically over the last 30 years. That allows us to offer value for money, but it also reduces the carbon footprint of travel. I think what we're going to have to look at now is just more radical ways in which we can abate that footprint. One is sustainable aviation fuel. In 24 versus 23, our consumption of sustainable aviation fuel increased fivefold, and we plan to have about 10% of our fuel by 2030 will come from SAF. I think secondly, it's all about your internal processes, ways you can reduce waste, ways you can electrify or use hybrid vehicles for your ground operation, ways you can remove weight from the aircraft. All of those small little marginal gains will reduce our carbon footprint. But then we're into more radical technologies that we also invest in, and we are an early seed investor in a company called ZeroAvia, which is looking to develop hydrogen propulsion. Of course, hydrogen propulsion is a massive transition, but I do think it will become a credible technology for things like short-haul and domestic travel within the next 10 to 15 years. There is all of the incremental gains that we can use in terms of just running a more efficient operation. And then there is some game-changing technologies out there like aviation or hydrogen propulsion that we are actively investing in and working on innovating.
Are you still, is it jet zero or net zero by 2050? Is that the goal?
Yeah, I think we have that ambition. What I would say as well is with an awful lot of the investment ecosystem that's emerging, do we have all of the answers to get to net zero by 2050? We don't. But I think what you've got is you've got an industry completely aligned and getting there. You've got a huge amount of investment going into innovative technologies. And I expect with that energy and that backing, we will get some breakthroughs as well that we haven't gotten our sights just now.
And Mirko, interesting for you to be listening to that because your business, again, is all about streaming and taking action on CO2 emissions and more. But what does sustainability mean for your business?
I very much like the approach by Sean with the more radical turns to be taken because, those incremental things to become more efficient in ground operations, for example, it's such a tiny fraction, but with technologies like hydrogen or SAF, so there you will find the levers to reach the goals. And they're not all there yet. Sustainability for us is obviously the reason we exist as a company. Therefore, it's pretty much the core of everything that we do. And with that, it also internally helps us to get, for example, like-minded people on board. Of course, not every company is as big as British Airways, but there is a lot of small and medium-sized companies that didn't have anything to do with sustainability until now, and they need to have some tools at hand to start. We want to provide the data to get this decarbonization wheel into motion, because you always need to provide transparency when you want to then reduce something, because otherwise it will not sustain if you cannot provide the data on the actual reduction and not just some.
What always works is hearing about those success stories where SHIPZERO has made a significant impact on reducing emissions. And I wondered if you could share with us on the podcast any of those.
Yeah, sure, definitely. I think it's super important that companies are enabled to also monetize off the reductions, because otherwise it will be something that is interesting now, but then will go away as maybe regulation gets a bit less tight than it is maybe at the moment in some areas. We have one of the leading food transport companies, the Nagel Group. They have just below 10,000 trucks on the road, also a goal of reducing emissions by 40% until 2030 already. And at the same time, they grow 5 to 10% every year. So this is, of course, kind of a disconnect, because if you want to grow business and grow revenue, at the same time, decarbonizing is hard. But for us, it's then important to say we need to reduce the emission intensity first. So that's kind of this relative number of CO2 emitted per ton kilometer traveled. And at the same time, reduce the absolute emissions over the next years. And for that, there is different levers. So the one is SAF of aviation is HVO on land transportation. Then there's LNG, bio-LNG in the best case. They also started an own sub-company or startup doing electric deliveries in the last mile. So all of those small things then add up into a kind of a substantial reduction potential. And the last thing that we now get into, also with a lot of other customers, the topic of book and claim, where you can then kind of sell your reductions to other customers. The insetting world works in a way that you try to reduce at the roots of where emissions happen. And then afterwards, you need to allocate them. And of course, the most direct way is to allocate them to your direct customer who paid for that transport. But this is sometimes not feasible, and then you can still sell it to another of your customers who's maybe in another region. And this concept will enable the industry itself to get going much faster than it does at the moment. And this is also a concept that works in air and sea transportation.
Sean, would you be interested in that?
Well, I think we see it emerging already. We've a lot of our corporate customers and a lot of our freight forwarders are very interested in accessing credit for buying SAF as the fuel of transportation rather than jet kerosene. So we see that Scope 3 market beginning to scale. And I think it does introduce some commercial opportunities actually into the ecosystem, which are going to be very, very important in scaling these technologies. Ultimately, I think customers and consumers are pushing us in this direction. And it's creating momentum. And I think it's also creating business opportunities for the technology players in there. So I would be very aligned with what Mirko is saying there. And I think what is beginning to happen is, how quickly can you scale? They're the questions rather than are you doing this, particularly when it comes to sustainable aviation fuel. And we're introducing it into the sites of our customers. So for instance, in our loyalty program, you can now get a tier bonus if you buy a SAF credit. And it's just ways of making people aware that we're developing more sustainable modes of transport, and they can participate in the commercialization of that going forward.
And of course, the production of SAF could in itself create jobs in an industry there. Where are we with plants being created?
We think the kind of legislative environment is getting there. We just need to make sure that we have the investment side lined up to build these plants. We think we could be building about 20 SAF plants in the UK, creating employment in parts of the UK that really would benefit from it, and probably repurposing a lot of old refinery sites as well. So these will be jobs created in the industrial heartlands of the UK, in refinery sites, both in the construction and the ongoing running of these plants. It's a great opportunity, I think, for levelling up.
Yeah, and I suppose it's one of those acronyms, SAF, that you're so familiar with. But again, that's sustainable aviation fuel. But we'll be hearing a lot more about that going forward.
Yes, and I think, look, sustainable aviation fuel has a anywhere up to a 70 to 100% carbon life cycle reduction, but it's also about creating some energy independence. People are excited about renewable energy because it weans them off the dependency on oil, which reduces volatility and creates more energy autonomy. It's the same with solar. So I think there is some hard economic realities behind the push to a more sustainable economy, as well as the mandates coming from regulation.
Let's change tack now from environmental sustainability to sustainable futures for people and communities. So Sean, I'll stay with you for now. Perhaps you could share some examples of how BA is engaging with local communities and supporting social initiatives.
We're a big employer. We employ about 40,000 people, the vast majority of whom are employed in the UK. And I think what I'm very proud of is the fact that we are now scaling more and more opportunities for people to come and work in British Airways from a range of backgrounds. We've about 400 people now in our apprentice programs. And I think, that's bringing people into the airline from a range of backgrounds, community colleges, not necessarily university graduates. And the success stories of some of our apprentices is something I'm very proud of, because they're going on to do great things in the business. We've trebled the size of that apprentice program, and we have about 360 people in the airline at the minute. The other thing we're focusing on as well is improving opportunities to come in to professions which historically have been inaccessible, such as becoming a pilot at British Airways. And we've just relaunched our Speedbird Academy, which will sponsor about 150 pilots a year to join our flight deck. And that is an opportunity for people from diverse backgrounds, lower income backgrounds, who have the capability but don't necessarily have the opportunity fiscally to kind of sponsor themselves through to the flight deck. We kind of support communities in two guises. One is we have our community fund, and we launched that back in 2022, and we've raised about £6.5 million, which is going into projects in the UK. We have about 59 strategic partners, and we have supported about 300 initiatives over the last 3 or 4 years. And we have then our Comic Relief Partnership, where we fundraise on board the aircraft. We've raised about 30 million over the last 10 years. That goes to a mix of UK projects, but also it goes into projects overseas. But more and more we're tilting into, I think, education, into supporting opportunities for young people, and also into enabling social mobility, getting people to consider jobs in companies like British Airways as being accessible in a way that they may not have done in the past.
Sounds absolutely fantastic. You're also very big in the Business and the Communities Leadership Council. That's important to you. What does that actually involve?
Well, I think, ultimately, I was delighted when Mary asked me to join, because, when we look around at some of the challenges in the UK at the minute, we don't necessarily have an employment problem because unemployment is low, but we have a quality of employment problem. We need to improve the mobility and the progression of people, particularly at the kind of entry level to employment. And also, I think we have a social mobility challenge, and that generation after generation are not breaking out of some of the cycles that they're in. And I think it's incumbent upon businesses to actually try and break those cycles by, one, offering support, two, I think leveraging an awful lot of our corporate resources to help with the business and the community objectives in the more deprived parts of the UK, but also three, I think, to listen as to what's broken and how we can fix it. And look, we're part of the fabric of British society. I think business in the community is a very important way in which we can give back and lend our expertise and resources to kind of break some of these negative cycles the community finds themselves in. I'm looking forward to actually getting out and visiting one of the projects soon in Hounslow, which is just very close to our operation, and seeing a bit more in real life what BITC gets up to. But I've been very impressed with the energy and some of the opportunities that we're working on.
Yeah, that's one of the King's seeing is believing visits. Fabulous. Now, Mirko, when you hear Sean talking about, 40,000 members of staff and you have 60, I want to put the same question to you. I want to see, what you're doing for your people, I suppose, who work for you. You said you've no problem recruiting at the minute, but what about the people around you and the communities?
I think for us, it's about learning how to lead, because as we've been growing and doubling in size, most people that were all early on board are now already leaders of smaller teams. And this is something where we currently put focus on to internally, first of all, build those leadership abilities. I also personally always try to inspire younger peoples, maybe earlier in their career paths, to find their passion and potentially also a career path in the sustainability space. There's a lot of potential to also get the brightest minds into those roles to really change the world in the future.
I love this discussion around, learning how to lead. Mirko, did you have anybody that inspired you or that you looked to for guidance? And, how did you learn how to lead?
Very good question. I think for me, it was mostly two things. The one is obviously learning by doing, maybe sports environments. If you ask for one role model from sports, maybe you know him, it's Dirk Nowitzki, the basketball player who was, I think, an exceptional leader and at the same time just a very profoundly nice person, very approachable all the time, and who got together a group of people which were definitely not the ones with the best foundation to win a title in the US and still made that happen. So staying very humble while being very, very successful is, I think, a very important value.
Sean, how did you learn how to lead?
I think a big chunk of it is by osmosis, to be honest, as well as being fortunate to kind of be put on various programs in terms of capability development. But I would say that we should never be afraid of failure. I've learned a lot more from failure and things that have gone wrong than things that have gone well. And I think big organizations sometimes try to kind of hide from failure. And it's very important that we're up for taking risks and that we bounce back quickly. So for me, what I've learned about good leaders is one is they're humble enough to acknowledge when it goes wrong, because then you correct course quickly. Number two, I think when people come into the organization, they say, well, how do I get on and prosper in the organization? The best networking you can do, I think, is do a good job, put your head down, over deliver on people's expectations. And people will want to work with you in the future, and they'll want you to be part of their teams, and they will pull you up through the organization as they progress. And we need to be as well encouraging people to kind of take on new challenges, even if they might not feel they're 100% ready. And that's about encouraging people to be brave.
That's it. And that's what they say as well, that's actually what fear is. That's the feelings and everything that you're experiencing is because you're being brave and you're having to be brave and bold and go out there. Okay, we're nearly at the end of our fabulous discussion, but I'd love to know if you've any questions you'd like to ask each other. Mirko, do you have any questions for Sean?
Yes, I would have one also from the discussion now, as the one SAF won't be available in necessary quantities in the very near future. And as you, Sean, have said yourself, that the technology to solve our big problems of the emissions in air transport are not there yet. How do you personally also maybe cope with this position of being a leader of such a crazily impactful organization? I think the footprint of British Airways is probably very comparable to Ireland in the scope, because you need to grow the business for your shareholders. And at the same time, the footprint is just crazily high, and probably most shareholders also don't care too much if it goes further up.
Yeah, I think what we've got to be is we're a bit of a kind of a conductor between our customers and the industry, because if we buy them from Boeing and we buy the engines from General Electric and Rolls-Royce, yet then I think the expectation on being sustainable primarily falls on the airlines as opposed to the original equipment manufacturers. So I think our job is actually to kind of convey the concerns and the urgency of both governments and consumers right up the chain in aviation, and also then to make sure that policy is kind of accelerating in the right way. Our job is to choreograph and I think communicate across government and the industry through the voices of our customers. And, that's something that requires a lot of tenacity. Our brand is always in the spotlight. It gives us a platform. And I think for us, sustainability is a non-negotiable. It's a right to operate in the future, which is pretty fundamental. And I think as well, we should bear in mind that people get great joy out of travel. I think people don't have a problem with travel. They just have a problem with the carbon footprint we leave. So I think a bit like you, we have a very strong purpose at the heart of our organization that keeps us very energized. And part of what I want to do is make sure that future generations have the opportunity to see the world in a way that I did, but in a way that leaves a smaller carbon footprint. Mirko, I just was wondering, do you feel that investors are playing into businesses like yours that are innovating with the right time horizon? What's your experience of kind of getting capital and getting backing?
Very good question. It really, really, really depends on the background of the investors. We have probably talked to some hundreds over the last years, because especially in the very early days of the company, it was very hard to get funding because the topic was still very, very young. In 2020, there was not much eye on the topic of emissions data. It was somehow interesting, but no one would pay for it. Back then, it was very hard for us to convey our message around that it's monetizable. This changed a bit as we got in touch with more investors with a sustainability background, because for a generic investor, you would have to provide the normal KPIs and at the same time, sustainability KPIs. And of course, we will not scale at a pace of an e-commerce startup. Now we are at a size where the investors know more about sustainability and also logistics industries. So now we have a partner with ETF partners, so the Environmental Technology Fund from London, who have a great footprint in this whole sustainability area. And they know very well that it's not something you can just scale for 2 years and then sell for 100 times the price in the beginning.
Great answer to a great question. Now, Sean, you've already said that you love reading, but I'd love if each of you could now share with our listeners maybe one piece of research or one report that has inspired you to be more responsible. So what could they listen to? What could they read? What could they learn? Mirko?
Personally, I'm a bit more inspired by people than from reading. So I very much like, for example, the visualizations and data storytelling backgrounds of Hans Rosling, who shows us, I think, very well that we as a society are doing well in some areas, not in all, but in some areas, especially in the social areas. And if you want something to read, then I can just pinpoint to the State of European Transport report from last year, because it shows that the transportation industry will, if everything continues like at the moment, will be responsible for around 50% of European emissions by 2030, because it's the only industry where still emissions are rising, and in every other major industry, they're going down. So comparably, that's quite a track we are on. So there is, I think, a bit of urgency to do something about it.
Thank you for sharing those, Mirko. Sean, over to you.
One is kind of a book, I think, which has influenced the way I think about managing people, and it's Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And I think it talks an awful lot about the power of deep thinkers and introverts in solving the problems in your business. And sometimes corporate culture is all about rewarding extroverted behavior. But I think Daniel Kahneman gets under the skin of the two modes in which we think through life every day, and also the value in giving people who are a bit less outwardly, confident, or maybe project a bit in a more understated way, the opportunity to have a voice in the organization. And I think that's been quite a powerful insight for me in terms of how we assess talent and how we allow people to blossom.
Final question for you both. Mirko, as a responsible leader, what are you personally committed to doing more of or less of in the coming year?
I think more of is still learning how to be also a good leader myself. I think we nearly all should do that and try to continue becoming better at what we do. And at the same time, this inspiration of younger people is something that still drives me, and I would like to get in touch with people in the community in the sense of, for example, schools, where we've already done projects in the past of, it's not teaching, but rather showing how a path towards being an entrepreneur or being in the sustainability field can look like in the educational system here in Germany, at least. And I think in the long term, we can only be successful if we have those smaller role models. It doesn't have to be the really great and far away people, but rather people whom we can talk to, whom we can touch and be in contact with, who can guide us on small decisions and just have healthy relationships with them.
Oh, totally. I think everybody would agree with that. Can't be what you can't see, but just to be able to have a conversation with someone and ask a question is incredible. Thank you for that, Mirko. Sean, same question to you. What will you be personally committed to doing more of or less of?
Like similar vein, I think I plan to get out and about across the business a lot more, and probably into some of the projects that we support in the community, with a kind of bias towards actually listening a lot to, younger generations of workers, people in the community, for a couple of reasons. One is, I think, just to kind of hear about sort of challenges and trends and ways that we can sort of support future generations, particularly in pursuing careers in aviation. But also, I think what we see in society generally is that when it comes to trends and technologies, it's younger generations adopt them and older generations follow. And I think when I think about AI and I think about all of the exciting new frontiers that are coming that can affect consumption of businesses in the future, we'll see them not necessarily in the people we interact with usually, but in younger generations. And I want to stay abreast of how people are behaving and how they're actually engaging with brands like British Airways. I think what I'm going to do less of is probably worry about the things that we can't control. It's a crazy world at times, and control the controllables is probably our motto for 2025.
Well, I'm glad to hear that even you, to your senior level in British Airways, worries about that too. I think everybody wakes up and tries to control, and you just have to step back. I think we could all definitely take away something from our conversation today. Thank you so much for joining us on The Lens, Sean Doyle, Chairman and Chief Executive of British Airways, and indeed Mirko Schedlbauer, Founder and CEO of SHIPZERO. You've been listening to The Lens with me, Sarah Travers. If your business would like support to understand how responsible business means good business, then please visit www.bitc.org.uk. Thank you to my guests, and thank you for listening. Do tune in next time.